Good day. My name is Kathleen Jamieson. I direct the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion of ways to deal with what can be done with online harassment of women in public life. It's also my pleasure to introduce our moderator and the person who's coordinating this program for us, Susan Ness, former member of the Federal Communication Commission, distinguished scholar at the Annenberg Public Policy Center and the German Marshall Fund, and the founder and co-chair of the Transatlantic Working Group, which focused on content moderation and freedom of expression. Susan, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Jamieson. And I also want to thank the Annenberg Public Policy Center and the National Democratic Institute for hosting this vital discussion. Gender disinformation and online harassment of women in public life is an urgent and pervasive issue. It's a global issue, and it has a profound impact on democracy. Anita Jankowicz's groundbreaking Wilson Center study of 13 female politicians across 6 social media platforms, there were over 336,000 pieces of abusive content shared by over 190,000 users. And this was just in a 2-month period. 78% of that content was directed towards then Senator, now Vice President Kamala Harris. Generally, these attacks are designed to discourage women from entering careers in public life, change views on women's political participation, and change political outcomes. As a political, government, or civil society leader, your career requires you to engage online. And in light of these attacks, what would you do? For our conversation today, we are very fortunate to have the leading experts on gender disinformation and harassment of women in public life to discuss these issues. We will focus on practical solutions, what platforms, governments, and civil society can do to stem the torrent of vicious attacks. Your invitation included the bios of our speakers, so I won't go into detail. During the discussion, we'll try to address your questions, so please click on the Q&A button with your questions and join in the conversation on chat. We hope to address as many of your questions as possible. So we'll begin with Brittan Heller. Brittan?
Good morning, Susan. Thank you for having me.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. You're counsel to the Foley Hoag law firm, working on technology and human rights. And you also initiated a landmark anti-cyber harassment litigation in which you were the target.
Yes.
What happened to you? And how does that fit into trends of typically who becomes the target of online abuse? What happened to you? Sure.
Well, first off, thank you for having me here today. It's a very important topic, and I'm happy to talk about it. I sometimes joke and say that I was patient zero for online harassment. Back when I was a student at Yale Law School, I found myself targeted by this message board. And luckily, this was before Twitter, but as I'll talk about later, the impact that you see of harassment on modern platforms was everything was still there, just in a different form. So it started off as, I believe the original person was a young man that I had turned down for a date, and I'd gotten into Yale Law School, and he hadn't. And the day after, there was a study group gathering to celebrate, all of these postings started appearing on an online forum. I wasn't a part of the forum, so I initially didn't know what it was or what it was about. It was stupid bitch to attend Yale Law was the first post, and it started including lots of patently false things about me, that I pretended to be a minority, that I was functionally illiterate, that I bribed my way into school with with money or sexual favors, that I was a Muslim terrorist, things that were kind of ludicrous, but the fact that somebody would take the time to put all of this out there was in and of itself damaging. Somebody also impersonated me and pretended to fight back in a very immature and inexpert way. So that is something also that you see happening today. Lots of impersonations online. At first, I just tried to ignore it because I didn't use the forum, and it just seemed immature and kind of strange. So I wrote the people who ran the forum and asked them if they informed them it wasn't me, informed them that this was happening, and expected that they would do something about it. If you fast forward about a year and a half, I've started applying for jobs at law firms and summer associate positions, and I end up getting no offers, which kind of confuses the Yale people, because I had a very strong application. And basically I was told by representatives of the law firms, like, we'd love to hire you, but have you Googled yourself? Do you see what comes up? And it turns out that the harassment had continued for a year and a half without me sort of tracking it. And it just filled what would come up when you search for me with all of those type of allegations. And I was told by the law firms, if you can clean that up, we'd love to hire you, but we can't have our clients associating that type of information with the firm, whether or not it's true. So I asked the law firm if they would, I asked the website if they would take it down, and they ignored me. At the same time, it sort of piqued their interest. So they started an affiliated Girls of the Top 14 Law Schools contest, where they encourage people to follow women around, to take their pictures so they don't have the copyright, and then they would post the pictures with entreaties of the women underneath. They thought it was funny, and the entreaties were things like, why are you doing this to me? This picture isn't me. Why are you trying to ruin my life, my family, my friends, my church, my work? And they thought it was funny, so they put it underneath. The pictures were also doctored. So my picture ended up showing up on crime scene photos because I was one of the luckier targets. As you can imagine, the type of content that altered media would trend towards. I ended up going back to the website and saying, all right, this is not okay. Please help, would you mind? And they said, freedom of speech, you're gonna have to sue us. And I said, okay. I realized that I had standing. I had a quantifiable injury, and most people who are harassed online don't have that ability to prove their harm in a way that a court will accept. So it was a pro bono suit. We announced it on the front page of the Washington Post. There were other Jane Does. I ended up talking very publicly about what had happened to me. And then it got a lot worse. I ended up having to have the FBI escort me to finals, and ended up having to take a leave of absence from law school after the school and local law enforcement told me that they couldn't. Basically, there were too many. I had too many threats against me, and there was no way to really accommodate for that at the school. Someone ended up sending a letter to the law firm that took a chance on me, to every partner they could find, the hiring partners, the managing partners, and it was an indictment of my crimes against men. So they sent a similar one to all of the professors at my law school. It went on for about 2.5 years. Doxing was also a large part of it. So they put my address, my phone number, my class schedule, descriptions of what I was wearing every day, and it followed me around. It also impacted my ability to participate in class, because some of the people who were participating in the forum ended up being my classmates. So they would put a running commentary every time I would speak up in class. And that's really damaging when you feel like you have absolutely no privacy. They would comment on when I went to the gym and where I was studying, and it was very, very isolating, because you felt like I had no ability to fight back, and that the people doing this to me were unknown and constantly in my physical environment.
But you brought a lawsuit and you were successful with that suit at the end of the day.
I was. Most people aren't. So the point of the suit was to see if an average person experiencing this type of targeting could get redressed through the legal system. And the answer was immediately no, because I had access to resources that most people didn't. So I had the attention of the media. The Wall Street Journal law blog followed this play by play. It was stark to me how if this was happening and I wasn't at Yale Law School, I would have no recourse.
And similarly, this is the case for women who are in public life, in public
Yes.
office, in high levels of government, the same sort of thing that you experienced, even more so today than it was perhaps back then.
Absolutely. I feel like the kind of lessons that you can pull from what happened to me are very applicable to women in public life, for a couple of reasons. Number one, the top indicator, the top risk factor, if you're going to be harassed online, is if you present with a female identity. If people assume, and I say that, but because it's beyond just a name. Sometimes if it's a local forum, people will use your voice to identify you as female, or I do a lot of work in spatial computing, AR, VR, and if people think harassment is not a problem in there, I challenge them to go into a social VR chat for 2 minutes with a female avatar and see what happens.
This is just a real visual explanation of why this issue is such a critical one for not just women in public life, but also women in general. Let's return to that conversation in a few minutes, but I'd like to have a greater discussion now of what gender disinformation is, and that would be with Nina Jankowicz. Nina, you're an internationally recognized expert on disinformation and democracy. You said at the Wilson Center. Next spring, you're coming out with a book on how to be a woman online. You've written extensively on this topic. What are the national security implications of gender disinformation?
Thanks again for having me, Susan, and to the Annenberg School and NDI for hosting this event. And thanks to Brittan for sharing her story. I think it's so important to hear these explanations of what actually happens with online harassment, because this isn't just about women's hurt feelings. It has a real material impact on people's lives offline as well. And it's not just a women's issue. As you said, Susan, it is a national security imperative that we solve this issue, that we begin to address it, because we haven't really done that yet. And when I first made this argument earlier this year in the report that you referenced at the beginning of the session, Malign Creativity, which looks at women in public life and the harassment they receive, we also had some case studies of prominent female journalists who had been attacked by Russia, Iran, and China. And I made that very explicit link that misogyny online leaves us open to manipulation by our foreign adversaries. And I got trolled for that. And to the men who trolled me for that, and to others who engage in casual misogyny online every day, I say that they are making the job of our adversaries easier. They are doing that every single day. And here's how this works. Countries engaging in disinformation, whether Russia, China, Iran, or any of the folks who are entering the field now that the playbook is blown open for everybody to see, and it's easy to do. It doesn't cost very much money. There's not very much consequence for it. They are not making up these false stories. They're not making up fissures in society. They are seizing on pre-existing fissures to drive and amplify polarization and undermine democracy. And in the United States, as well as many other countries, there is ample evidence of the endemic on and offline misogyny that exists. A few examples: when I first started studying this phenomenon in 2017 in the research process for my first book, I kept hearing from women in countries like Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, and Ukraine, who had been attacked by purportedly the Kremlin because of their prominent role as women in public life, and attacked with very sexualized narratives. One woman, a member of parliament in Ukraine, had her face superimposed on naked women's bodies, and a rumor started that she was going to run naked down the main street of Kyiv that got so much traction in the online environment that a German reporter from a reputable outlet asked her about that allegation when she was giving a speech at the United Nations. In Georgia, a fake sex tape was shown of a woman who was married to a prominent politician and herself was an editor of a prominent opposition magazine. Now, she was able to prove that it was fake. Other women didn't have proof like that, and their lives were basically ruined in this very hierarchical, patriarchal society. In the Malign Creativity Report, as I said, we have examples of prominent journalists who work on issues related to Russia, China, and Iran, who have been attacked by all three of those countries using sexualized and gendered disinformation. And recently, I completed a report looking at overt Russian propaganda in 2020. I went through all of the posts from many overt Russian propaganda outlets, finding over 2,500 instances of gendered disinformation during that year, pushing false narratives about traditional roles of motherhood, about domestic violence in Russia, and other gender-related problems in the country, as well as, because it was an election year here in the United States, false narratives about Kamala Harris. Now, Susan, you mentioned that we saw 78% of the over 300,000 pieces of gendered abuse and disinformation that we saw directed at Kamala Harris. A lot of that disinformation was this idea that Kamala Harris has slept her way to the top, that she didn't belong in power. We also saw some fake narratives that she was actually secretly a man, transphobic narratives. And a lot of this also appeared in Russian disinformation in the year 2020 in Russian language, again, being lifted from our social media, our conversation, our discourse. And as a reminder, I don't think anybody needs a reminder of this, but Russia used misogynist, ageist narratives to discredit Hillary Clinton in 2016 as well. So our adversaries see this misogyny online, they exploit it, they amplify it, and that makes me worried about future technological developments, which brings me to deepfakes. Everybody's concerned about deepfakes and nuclear war or election interference, but I'm a lot less worried about that than I am about how women figure into the deepfake equation, because research shows right now the vast majority, nearly 100% of the deepfakes that exist online are non-consensual deepfake pornography of women. These models are trained on women's bodies, and in countries like India have already been deployed against opposition activists. So I think it's only a matter of time before we see a prominent woman in American life targeted by a foreign adversary with deepfake pornography. And even if we're able to prove it's a deepfake, I don't imagine that many men or detractors of women in the United States or elsewhere will decide not to watch it after that. So we're in a very serious situation and we really need to take action. So I'm glad that we're here to talk about the solutions today.
You talked about malign creativity. Can you describe what that is very briefly?
Yeah, so this is what I see as the biggest obstacle to really taking action against online abuse and disinformation. And it is when we see abusers online morphing their tactics. So they might say the word bitch, but instead of writing bitch, they'll use an exclamation point instead of the I. Or they will create a Facebook group that says AOC fan club and memes, but all that will be in the AOC fan club and memes group is terrible photoshopped images with fake narratives alleging false stories about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That's the sort of thing that evades detection by the social media platforms and makes it very hard to be proactive about this stuff, but that doesn't mean it's not impossible. If my research team of 6 people was able to find it, I think the multi-billion-dollar platforms that are supposed to have a duty of care to their users and purportedly have terms of service that everyone should be operating by should be able to detect and enforce these terms of service in order to serve 50% of the world.
We were talking about women in public life. What evidence have you found that there is self-censorship, particularly among the young women in the face of gender disinformation?
This is the scariest thing for me. I have experienced it myself. I think twice before writing a certain provocative piece or sending a provocative tweet and think about, do I really want to deal with this today? I'm somebody who's practiced at this now, unfortunately. I've dealt with it for a long time, but young women just don't want any part of it. And I did some focus groups for my new book that's coming out in April. And here are some of the things that these young women told me. They're very savvy. They say, we know not to talk to everyone we meet. We're careful about what we post because we've seen people crash and burn because of the mistakes they made. So in a way, that's admirable. We don't want them endangering their chances of getting into college or having a stain on their internet search history forever. But it also means that they are self-censoring. They will keep locked accounts if they're on social media at all, or they have a fake Finsta, which we heard a lot about during the Frances Haugen testimony, and that they just share with a couple of friends, just their closest friends, and that's their real true feelings. Now, that's very different than how I operated growing up in the internet era. I had a MySpace, I had blogs, I posted on YouTube, and maybe that was a little bit too aggressive, but I do think we are losing these young women's voices, and when they see the sorts of things that are happening to their friends who do decide to speak out, when they see the replies to Kamala Harris's tweets and posts on Facebook, when they see the most powerful women in America being treated this way, they're going to think twice before they not only participate in public discourse, but put themselves in public careers. And hat tip to Moira, who will be talking to us in a second. She turned me on to this study from Plan International, which surveyed over 2,000 women and girls about online harassment. And of those who have been harassed very frequently, 19% said they use social media platforms less, and 12% have stopped using them. So we are losing crucial voices in our democracy, and that makes this a democratic issue. It means that when young women see men's tweets being retweeted twice as often on Twitter, or when they see a platform like Reddit where there's only 30% female user base, they're going to think, what's the point? I'm just going to stay at home. And we cannot afford to let that happen. We need a more equitable online environment.
Thank you, Nina, for setting all of that out. Yoel Roth, you're the global head of site integrity and director of trust and safety at Twitter. And perhaps even more importantly, you earned your doctorate at the Annenberg School for Communication here at Penn. Over the years, there have been many reports of harassment of women, not just on Twitter, but also on other platforms. Have platforms made meaningful progress in addressing this issue? And what are the obstacles to progress from the industry standpoint?
Thanks for the question, Susan, and thank you so much for convening this event. Also, thank you to Brittan and Nina for sharing their experiences and for giving us such, I think, valuable material to talk about today. I want to start by kind of locating this within what I see as a broader re-envisioning of what the job of online policy is. Historically, when we've talked about cyberbullying, we've prioritized the cyber in it. It's all about what happens online. And we sort of think about online communities as these self-contained spaces where it happens online and then you close your computer and the consequences go away. And of course, we all know that that's not true. And we've known that that's not true for decades. We've known it since the days of text-based chat rooms. There's lots of research that establishes the very significant emotional and in some cases physical consequences of online activity. But it's my view that platform policies have historically under-indexed on the offline consequences of online speech, and at times, as a result of that, have over-indexed on defending expression. And so I want to sort of locate some of the work that we're doing here and some of the challenges we have within a context of change around those issues specifically. At Twitter, we use international human rights frameworks to try to inform our policies and the way that we govern our platform. But those frameworks are multivariate balancing acts and not something where there's a clear rubric that tells you what you should be prioritizing in a given situation. Every policy is going to have specific trade-offs connected with it. You have to balance factors of physical safety, free expression, privacy, and those things are frequently going to be in tension with each other within the same policy and within an enforcement regime. Nina mentioned as one example the chilling effects and self-censorship consequences of online harassment. We worry a great deal about those because they mean that people don't want to or choose not to participate. There's also chilling effects that are connected with over-moderation. And so I think what you've seen a lot from platforms is that these tensions become paralyzing and that you become stuck in an environment of saying there's not a great answer to any of these questions. At Twitter over the last few years, our work has coalesced around physical safety as our top priority, which has prompted a reevaluation of a lot of our policies, and more importantly, the ways that we implement those policies. For us, the most important thing that we've been focused on has been reducing the burden on the victims of online abuse and harassment to have to report activity to Twitter themselves. There's a re-victimization that happens when not only do you experience harassment, but then you have to do the work of telling a platform about it in the hopes potentially that they'll do something as a consequence. 3 years ago, virtually all of Twitter's content moderation actions were reactive to reports from users, outside of a very narrow set of policies like our rules around child sexual exploitation. We generally weren't proactively seeking out violative content. And there's been a sea change around this within Twitter. We went from effectively 0% to now ending 2021 at more than 65% of the content we remove being found proactively by our systems. That's not mission accomplished. 65% is nowhere near good enough. There's a ton of opportunity for us to improve how we're able to proactively detect things. And then even from there, there's content that right now doesn't fit within our policies or that we're missing some of the context about. But the metrics here show a foundational realignment in how platforms are thinking about their roles and responsibilities in this space. And that's prompting a lot of different investments in our policies and in the technologies that we build to help us do better in this space. To your question about obstacles, I think the core issues we're seeing really tie back to the title of Nina's Wilson Center report, which is Malign Creativity. Historically, when we've thought about abuse and harassment, we've thought about them as content issues. We look at stuff tweet by tweet. We want to understand the nuance. We parse every word and every phrase within the tweet. But as Nina and others have noted, abuse and harassment are also behavioral. They're networked phenomena, they're adversarial, they're innovative. And we're dealing with highly sophisticated and in some cases coordinated groups and individuals who are trying to achieve a strategic outcome, which is silencing women online. Since 2017, platforms, including Twitter, have invested heavily in addressing some of the challenges of disinformation, coordinated manipulation, and so on. But we've largely focused that work in the election security context. My organization at Twitter, Site Integrity, focuses specifically on some of this work. And we've built technology to help us identify and disrupt malicious coordination. But we have a lot of opportunity here to bring some of that technology to bear on so-called content issues. We haven't yet fully deployed some of the techniques that we've been building in the disinformation context to help us address some of the more content-based challenges that we see in the safety and harassment space. There are terms for the types of behaviors that we're seeing here that highlight some of the nuance and kind of global complexity of the phenomenon. In Saudi Arabia, people talk about electronic flies. People talk about cyber armies and national troll groups. we need to think about these things not as isolated episodes of abuse and harassment, but as exactly what they are, which are networked phenomena. And we have to think about the consequences of them and the interventions for them the same way that we would think about a Russian troll farm that's trying to interfere in the American elections. That's a pretty foundational reconsideration. It's one that the industry, Twitter included, are beginning to make steps towards. Twitter introduced a policy around coordinated harmful activity. Facebook have been doing a lot of work around brigading. There are steps in the right direction here, but I would say we're still pretty much at the starting line of starting to think of harassment as a truly behavioral issue rather than approaching it tweet by tweet.
Have the companies been working together, coordinating on this? And is there more that can be done for such coordination?
The good news is we've built a lot of structures that allow the companies to not only share information, but also talk about the techniques and technologies that we use to identify malicious activity in the disinformation context. And again, I want to emphasize that our goal here shouldn't be to reinvent the wheel. Our goal should be to use the tools we already have and that we know work and apply them to novel contexts where they can have an impact. And so a lot of the work that Twitter and Facebook and Google and YouTube and Reddit and others across the industry have done to help us collaborate on election security issues are already being redeployed to help us think about brigading and other types of challenges. Now, there are some nuances here. When we talk about brigading, for example, we're often talking about real people, not fake accounts created out of a troll farm. And there's some slippage around that we can talk more about, but a lot of the foundational concepts of not competing on these issues, but collaborating as an industry, and also sharing openly information about some of the adversaries and threat actors that we're tracking are absolutely lessons that are being applied across companies.
Thank you, Yael, for that. Let's also talk about government. And on that, I'm going to call on Asha Allen. Asha, you recently joined the Center for Democracy and Technology as its European Advocacy Director, and you're a longtime expert on online gender-based violence. How are existing legislative and policy frameworks being used to tackle online harassment of politically engaged women?
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today and to the organizers for inviting me. As you know, and as you've mentioned, I've been speaking about this topic for many, many years now, and I will continue to do so until we see some significant improvements. And before I get into the question on the existing legislation, I really want to take us back to the macro level, to the holistic perspective here, because it has been touched upon by the incredibly brave testimony by Brittan and mentioned by Nina as well, and by Yael. But just to remind us of what we're talking about here, because women are 27 times more likely to experience online abuse. And this is inextricably worse if you're a woman of color. This increases by another 84%. The Interparliamentary Union report from several years ago showed that 50% of women parliamentarians in Europe had experienced some form of online harassment, most notably from some of their male colleagues in the parliaments that they were working with. I really wanted to pick up on what Nina said in terms of what's happening on the next generation and the impacts that it's having, because it is already happening. The European Institute for Gender Equality published information showing that 51% of the young women that they had spoken to felt that they could not engage in political discussion online. And we're beginning to see the collection of data that shows a kind of connection between that experience and the diminishing of young women entering into politics or traditional political parties. So what we're talking about here is parity democracy, increased representation. We're talking about the very foundation of women's rights here. And to bring us concluding to that holistic perspective, it's vital that we understand that online gender-based violence is part of the continuum of violence against women. We are talking about very specific forms of online gender-based violence, but we are also talking about the use of digital tools to perpetuate existing systemic mechanisms of oppression, whether that's intimate partner violence or other forms of violence against women and girls. So on that question of existing legislation, and when it comes to that, and not only the existing policy frameworks, but to content moderation mechanisms as well, many women simply feel let down in many dimensions. And one, that could be that platforms do not do enough under their terms and services to improve their experiences on their platforms. And two, nor when it comes to women being able to benefit from their procedural rights, for example, under existing legislation, or simply the fact that appropriate legislation doesn't exist. And it's essentially a reflection of what we're looking at, especially in the European context, as what we have is quite a fragmented framework of potentially useful national laws aimed at addressing specific forms of online gender-based violence, a missing adaptation of laws or laws that simply aren't there. So to give you an example of this, there are several national laws that we have seen introduced in the last 5 years, notably in France and Spain and Italy, all aim to address this issue. They focus quite heavily on image-based sexual abuse. But there's one thing to highlight here, and it's however due to a lack of a holistic understanding and intersectional approach that we see that even though it's a great step forward that we do have these national laws, some of these laws that were recently introduced are very limited in scope. For example, some of the laws aimed at addressing image-based sexual abuse, the law assumes a prior relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. When we know that a significant number of cases of image-based sexual abuse, for example, are conducted by unknown perpetrators and disseminated across community groups dedicated to the fact that the victim has no idea that this has happened until they find out at a later stage. So being able to access the protections of those laws are also limited in those cases because of how it has been phrased and how it's been interpreted. Now, this is now juxtaposed with other European countries who've adopted a more holistic approach, which involves recognizing the digital dimension within already existing legislation when it comes to gender-based violence more broadly. So looking at, say, the use of psychological control over one's platform access or social media access as part of psychological control in intimate partner violence, for example. There are some countries that have gone down this route, and we have seen new jurisprudence in the European Court of Human Rights that aligns with this perspective. But at the crux of this is the fact that we still lack a harmonized approach in Europe. Not all European countries, EU member states included, have ratified the best instrument that we have to date tackling the broader issue of gender-based violence, which is the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Domestic Violence and Violence Against Women and Girls. Now, this framework comes from 2011, so as you can imagine, a 10-year-old instrument simply won't address online gender-based violence comprehensively, but we do know that this is a priority for the Council of Europe. Just last week, they released their general recommendation, which addresses this. Their very first recommendation is on the digital dimension of gender-based violence. So we know that this is a political imperative, and understanding that there is a gap when it comes to existing legislation there. But I do just want to pick up on the point also when looking at this from a content moderation and terms of service perspective as well, because women similarly have vastly different experiences depending on what types of platforms or services that they may be using, or indeed if those women also represent other marginalized groups such as women of color or folks from the LGBTQI community, and their experiences in navigating those content moderation mechanisms, the ability to provide the nuance and context that they need can be very, very challenging. And to reiterate the point in that some may not feel the ability to be able to access those mechanisms because they're not entirely sure that they'll be able to get redress from using those. So again, there is that aspect that's coming. So I think we may talk about this a little bit more later in terms of the existing legislation, but we do have things that are upcoming, such as the Digital Services Act that's being discussed right now. And there's also going to be a directive on gender-based violence, which should include obligations on online gender-based violence as well. So what Europe needs to make sure it recognizes is that at this moment in time, it's ill-equipped to deal with online gender-based violence, and that at this moment in time, it leaves women without equal levels of protection or without equal access to procedural rights. And this is even more so in terms of equitable access for those who are most marginalized. So unfortunately, at this moment in time, we've had some steps in the right direction, but there's simply not steps far enough.
Thank you very, very much for that. And hopefully we'll be able to go back and talk a little bit about what's in the Digital Service Act that addresses these issues. But Moira, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. You're the Director of Democracy and Technology at our partner NDI and have worked for decades on global tech policy. We've talked about what tech companies can do. We've talked a little bit about governments, at least in Europe, and hopefully we'll pick up what the US is doing, if anything, on the topic. But what other opportunities exist for civil society as well as government to address the problem?
Well, thank you, Susan. I echo everyone's thanks for gathering us today, and NDI is happy to join you in hosting what we believe to be not just a really important conversation, but a truly solvable problem, and one that is fundamental to democracy. And therefore, it's been a major focus of our work. So beyond what we've already heard many of our guests mention today, we are exploring other solutions that can also help to contribute to this challenge, because what we're also seeing, beyond platforms, beyond legal frameworks, which are also critical, we have other opportunities such as codes of conduct in the context of elections and political parties around the world. We have commitments that civil society can make to not just make this an issue of women, but an issue facing all organizations. And it's something that we've begun training on quite extensively, because we will find that democracy organizations that happen to have a female leader, the NDI has faced itself with our country directors in some countries being targeted. And what we find is that, and I think this is an important distinction, it's not targeting a candidate or a woman because she's a woman. It's using a gender-based attack. So we found, for instance, that politically active women in some countries may wish a happy holiday, of a particular holiday coming up. And the amount of vitriol that comes back at them, an attack for you're a terrible mother, you're not spending enough time with your children, those sorts of things far outweigh what male colleagues experience. We've also found that it puts an additional burden on the staff, not just emotionally, but structurally. They have to spend far more time tracking this information down. So there's a dollars and cents burden that politically engaged women face. And then we do have the quantifiable evidence to know that many women are choosing then not to run. So in addition to training candidates and training people, we also can share their stories with platforms, which we have done, in order to help facilitate a different environment. And I do just want to name and fame, in a sense. One, I applaud Twitter's work and other platforms that are committed to this, but we are seeing success in areas, for instance, like Bumble, which is designing in a way that makes women feel safe in their dating life. So we do know that it's possible to not just create systems and platforms and experiences that enable women to feel comfortable and engage in very public ways, but we know that it's profitable. And so, I think what we're looking at is what are the full scope of solutions, because you mentioned civil society. The one thing we can do is continue to bring this up, not simply as an issue of women, but as an issue of democracy, which we truly believe it is, and is one reason that my team at NDI works very closely with our gender team, but we really classify this as a technology challenge because we believe it is a solvable problem. We, as others have mentioned, misogyny is a social ill, but misogyny online is something that we can fix, and we do believe that it is solvable. So continuing to engage and then holding platforms, governments, political parties accountable for those actions to make sure that they're implementing those changes is what's going to create a safer space, not just for women, but for democracy online.
Thank you for that uplifting comment at the end that this is solvable. It's good to hear that. Speaking of solving the issue, I'd like to bring all of the panelists back on to discuss this further, and more specifically, very specific concrete things that can be done, be it government, be it companies, civil society, or all three working together to address this problem. So I would encourage any of you who want to start out by coming up with some recommendations to start out, and then please comment back and forth on the panel.
I'll start. I just want to give some kudos to Yoel. I think it's so great that Twitter is working to shift the burden. That was one of the biggest recommendations of our malign creativity report. And as somebody who's dealt with online harassment myself, it can be so exhausting to have to report individually over and over and over. And now I know Twitter has introduced extra safety controls in order to mute certain keywords or mute all of your replies for a given period of time. All of that is really good. I would love to see Twitter and other platforms also introduce a way to file an incident report rather than just an individual report when you are being harassed, because in those incidents of networked harassment, which is usually what the worst ones are, brigading and things, they don't just come out of nowhere. It's because someone egged them on with a dog whistle or a straight up, hey, go bother Nina or Brittan today. And having that context and being able to say, this is what spurred this is what this tweet means, that malign creativity, so that those who are making content moderation decisions don't have to do as much research. Yes, this is putting a little bit more burden on targets of harassment, but those of us who go through this a lot, unfortunately, have help sometimes. So our friends will help us put these together. I think that will make it a lot easier to be able to add onto and track reports as events continue. So that's one thing for the tech companies that I think would be really important. Also for women in prominent positions, like let's say a candidate for vice president, or even at lower levels of public office. We're seeing some school board candidates and folks getting this sort of harassment now too, to be able to have a concrete point of contact at platforms with whom you can share, okay, this is the sort of harassment that I'm getting. These are the words that are typically being used, so you can update your classifiers so that your AI picks it up a little bit more frequently. Obviously, those need to be updated regularly because of malign creativity. But I think if we see that proactive outreach, and not just to white women, not just to women in the West, right? We need to do this for women who are in other non-English speaking, more misogynistic, more patriarchal countries as well. And that's where organizations like NDI play a really important role as that connective tissue between civil society partners and the tech companies here in the States. So those are two big things that tech can do. I'm sure we'll come back around to the policy solutions for governments in a little while, but just kicking things off.
Thank you, Nina, for that. Also, just want to remind folks in the audience that if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please use your Q&A button. And if you want to participate in the conversation, please use the chat function as well. Any other thoughts in terms of what can be done? Be it, we started, Asha, talking a little bit about the Digital Services Act, which is currently being debated within the European Union. Can you tell us a little bit about what's included within that as a solution to this? And then Yoel, if you could think a little bit about what needs to happen from a legislative standpoint that might be helpful or might not. Asha.
Of course, no, I'd be happy to. I mean, for those who aren't familiar, the Digital Services Act is essentially an update to a 21-year-old legal framework in the EU over digital services and platform governance. So as you can imagine, it's a huge piece of legislation, and it's going to touch on quite a few different areas. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the aspects in there. It's a very, very long piece of legislation, over 300 pages. If you have the time to read it, I would highly suggest that you do so. But at the same time, I want to kind of reiterate what I often refer to as the 3 H's, which is the human rights compliant framework, holistic approach, and harmonization. Because within that, all of this can be incorporated not only to the Digital Services Act, but notably the directive that I mentioned earlier, which will be presented either later this year or earlier this year, specifically on gender-based violence. So On the Digital Services Act itself, I mean, of course, it's a profound opportunity to reshape our digital ecosystems and kind of define new rules when it comes to platform governance. And as the process enters its next phase, it's vital that a human rights lens and the upholding of fundamental rights is the primary pursuit, because ensuring this will help tackle online gender-based violence and provide more transparency, accountability, and contribute to the promoting of a free and diverse and safe online space. Because I want to reiterate that point in how useful the online space has actually been for women's activism, for women's mobilization, especially in a shrinking civil society space. The changes that we've been able to see in terms of racial justice and sexual harassment and the conversations that we're able to have now have been so vital. So this is why it's so important to make sure that we uphold those fundamental rights, because an infringement on a woman's ability to express her free expression means that she's experiencing an infringement on her right to non-discrimination. So we need to be able to be very, very clear in that balancing, and the Digital Services Act is a real opportunity to do that. So I just wanted to talk about it very briefly, just two dimensions, because we could talk about it for the next 4 hours. So I wanted to be very quick in the points that I mentioned, and one could be very focused on what the kind of platforms and due diligence obligations that are there and where there can be improvements made there, and very concrete things that could be useful when it comes to other obligations. And so, for example, there is an introduction around increased transparency and due diligence frameworks, but unfortunately, we don't feel these are comprehensive enough. They could also refer to the fact that due diligence can include the encouragement and incentivization of platforms to enact human rights focused due diligence in their products and services, rather than on this conversation around takedowns and content moderation being focused on that. And this can be achieved, for example, in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which provides an excellent definition on due diligence that could be used throughout the entire value chain and throughout the stack, so that companies are really thinking about this from the source and from the outset there, and adopting this approach into the development of their services. And another aspect that's been introduced in the Digital Services Act that may be pertinent to raise here is around this idea of risk assessments and mitigating risks, systemic risks as they focus on in the text. And we believe that, unfortunately, it's a bit of a missed opportunity to not have these be human rights impact assessments, and for the European Commission to be able to develop guidelines to feed into these assessments. So though the Digital Services Act has taken some important steps forward, there is space for significant levels of improvement that really do center at its very heart that upholding of fundamental rights, and adopting that international human rights lens and referring to the international human rights framework as its very foundation. And just on my very last point of harmonization there, that brings us back to the directive, because we have two pieces of legislation moving forward at two different paces that inextricably need to be linked to one another in order to combat online gender-based violence. So in order for the EU to be successful in this, they need to be very, very clear in how those two pieces, the one that being a regulation and one being a directive, and how they work and support one another. Without doing so, at best, they're going to have two pieces of a legislation that don't speak to each other. At worst, they're going to nullify each other in some way on this issue of online gender-based violence. So it's so vital that they get this right, that they are in consistent consultation with civil society on this, and how to make that an improved framework. And more importantly, a practical and effective mechanism that's comprehensive and harmonized across the different mechanisms that they do adopt.
Thank you, Asha. That was very, very helpful. Any response from any of our panelists about this? How difficult is that? What are some of the obstacles, Yoel, to embed or bake in human rights into principles, into the services that you provide?
Yeah, I don't believe there are obstacles to doing so. And I think companies have been making measurable and specific progress in using tools like human rights impact assessments to understand the specific challenges that communities are facing or that come up in specific markets. I do think one of the systematic obstacles that I would love to see addressed in legislative and regulatory solutions here is around transparency and data sharing. And obviously we're talking a lot about this in light of the Facebook papers, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity legislatively to resolve some of the tensions that at least platforms claim in some cases prevent them from being able to share data meaningfully to help researchers study and understand the dynamics that we're talking about today. To be clear, I think there are solutions right now, even in the absence of legislation. Today, Twitter launched the Twitter Moderation Research Consortium, which is going to be an initiative that we launched in 2022 to help share more data with researchers about content moderation, safety, harassment, misinformation, disinformation challenges, a wide range of issues where we want to not only help people study these issues, but also use specific and empirical research to inform the solutions that we build out. But that can't just be a one platform thing. It is already the case that the overwhelming majority of research about social media focuses on Twitter because Twitter is the primary source of publicly available data. We get far more than our share of headlines, and that's fine. We are the beneficiaries of an incredible volume of research that identifies where we have problems. And I can say we read the research and we try to work on fixing those problems as best we can, but it can't be one platform. And so I think we do need regulatory solutions that will first give platforms the protections to be able to share data with researchers in meaningful ways. And second, in the event that there's a lack of transparency, that platforms have obligations to share meaningful information about what's going on and allow people to study some of their dynamics. I can say from our experience, this has been transformative in how we understand misinformation and disinformation. And I think it would be a substantial gap for any solution to not start to address some of the challenges created by GDPR, by ECPA, by other regulations that are built to protect privacy, but fail to appropriately navigate some of the tensions that come up around data sharing.
Of course, here in the US, we haven't made any progress whatsoever with respect to national privacy legislation, much less addressing these specific issues. The consortium that or the effort that you're talking about also is to have some sort of a regime for researchers, for vetting of researchers and approving that activity. Also making information somewhat standardized in terms of terminology, whatever, so that research can be conducted across the board. I know that there are provisions within the Digital Services Act that would address the research. What about in the US? Where are we on making any progress on that? And could, Yoel, could there be a consortium of companies working with civil society to come up with a plan that government can perhaps bless or oversee? What's your thought on that?
I would love for Moira and Brittan to weigh in on that, but I'd say I think there's always going to be balancing acts around institutionalizing some of this. And particularly, I want to highlight the need to encourage research, not just about the biggest and already well-studied Western countries, but to encourage research in some of the places that historically have been the least understood, especially on some of these issues like disinformation and gender-based harassment. I think we saw and we've talked about some of the challenges of how the Facebook papers were distributed primarily to American and Western journalists who are studying these issues in the US and in Western democracies. And I think that highlights sort of a foundational structural issue in the way that social media research happens. I don't think there's enough that we're doing to empower research outside of the West about what's happening on social media and to then apply those lessons to what we're seeing play out worldwide. And so I think there certainly are benefits to creating institutional solutions that bring together companies, but I don't think they can be American solutions. And I think creating institutions that tick some boxes, but only are solving for the US and Western Europe would be wholly inadequate solutions to deal with some of the most severe instances of gender-based disinformation and harassment that we've seen come up in the Philippines, we've seen it come up in India, we've seen it come up in Saudi Arabia, we've seen it come up in Mexico and Brazil. That's what we have to solve for, in my opinion.
Anyone want to comment on that or take that further? Moira.
I'm happy to jump in, and I agree with you. I think that, you know, I agree with you, Yoel, that there aren't barriers, but it would be wrong to say that this isn't a challenge. So when you take issues such as, you know, one of the things we often talk about is lexicon development in the many languages that social media exists in, the words that are used that can then educate AI. Those, as Nina mentioned, change over time. They become very localized around incidents. And we're also trusting that companies are looking at those and understand what they're seeing in a political context in which they're not experiencing every day and don't necessarily have content moderation capabilities in. So it can be done, but it is a challenge even on simple things like that. The other element I would say is around the research consortium. You know, there's a need that once you develop these lexicons, for instance, we would love to put them on a Creative Commons and let everybody, all the platforms, you know, look at one and say, okay, this is the common list of bad, nasty words that we should all be ready for, but bad guys get those too. And, you know, can become smarter and use those. So once you get into how we do this, it becomes really challenging. And the thing that I think civil society will continue to play a role in is around building trust, because the two institutions we've talked about so far, the government and social media platforms, simply do not have credibility when it comes to making women feel safe in the same way that civil society organizations do. And so maintaining conversation among researchers with organizations like NDI, where we spend time going to the platforms, explaining the experience of politically engaged women so that they can make systematic changes. We have a significant role to play to keep doing that. So there's the external advocacy of, you know, getting our torches and storming the gates, which we should continue to do. But there's the need for the space for more nuanced conversations, especially in really delicate environments where you're talking about not just women, but, you know, we've touched on this before, other marginalized communities in countries where it is illegal to be who you are. And the fact that social media is simply a click away of someone ruining your life by outing you as gay or, you know, identifying in any particular way, it's too easy. So we really do have to address the most challenging environments and the most challenging cases, and that will help advance the role of all people. But I do want to just make sure we park this conversation about trust and the trust gaps that exist and the roles that various organizations need to play in order to help advance this effort.
That trust is so vitally important. Brittan, please.
I wanted to draw a thread between Nina's comments and Moira's comments, where Nina was talking about how one of the best practices is to make sure that there is a contact at a company when somebody is experiencing extraordinary types of harassment that don't quite fit into the strictures of community standards or terms of service that they can reach out to. I used to run the Center for Technology and Society, and so we looked at the way that harassment and disinformation impacted religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and gender and sexual-based violence as well. What Moira is talking about is something that companies tend to ask advocacy groups for all the time. They ask for intelligence, and what I think is an interesting perspective would be if companies were to take greater action on harassment, they would have another means of getting that intelligence. Furthermore, as we've seen through the work of many people here, harassment is kind of a litmus test for people who want to test the boundaries of platform policy. because it has been a historically under-enforced area. And even though we've been making strides, you can look at state-sponsored disinformation and how its reliance on brigading and useful idiots, as we saw in the Russia context, was really the vector by which they reached into normal people's lives and tried to impact behavior. So I think that taking a if platforms were to look at this, like Nina says, as a national security issue, or like Moira says, as a an intelligence-based issue, we'd actually see better impacts on other type of online harms and create a healthier online ecosystem.
Thank you. Any response to Brittan's suggestion? Okay. We have one question that came up since we were talking about the international, looking at what's going on in India, how women politicians in India have been targeted. And the question for Nina, could you talk about your findings on women politicians in India, and Yoel, what is Twitter doing about it?
Sure. So the research that we did at the Wilson Center unfortunately only focused on English-speaking countries, just because of the lift that it would have taken to translate our code book into multiple languages. While we had the wherewithal to find that abuse, we didn't have unlimited time or resources. So that's step two. If anybody in the audience wants to fund that, let me know. But what I have learned about India, in particular with my research around deepfakes, is that one of the most successful deepfake pornography campaigns was against an opposition journalist in India named Rana Ayub. And her life was essentially ruined because of this deepfake pornography that was released against her, that was spread all around the internet, and the platforms did very little to mitigate that spread early on. And I think this is yet another incident in which non-white, non-Western countries are given short shrift in the social media environment, and something that I know platforms are striving to change, but we've not seen enough progress in that area in particular. So I'll throw it over to Yoel now.
Yeah, I mean, I first just want to acknowledge that I think there's a lot of opportunity here and a lot of work still to be done. But there's a couple of things specifically in the India context where Twitter's made investments in the last 18 months that speak directly to some of these specific challenges. The first is our focus on synthetic and manipulated media. Nina has talked a bit about deepfakes, and it's certainly true that the overwhelming majority of deepfakes and manipulated media, in fact, are non-consensual nudity and sort of manipulated pornography. But I would note that Twitter's policies in this space are not technology specific. We don't look just for the most sophisticated AI-based deepfakes that are sort of the most technologically advanced. We look for media that is altered, cropped, taken out of context, shared with misleading context, and we take action on that under our policies. And the reason I emphasize this is that one of the most common, because it's one of the easiest techniques of manipulation that we've seen deployed as a technique of gendered harassment, is sharing media out of context. You share an image that from a certain angle maybe can be framed to make somebody look like they are unwell or like they're doing something. You show a cropped fragment of a speech from a politician that misrepresents their viewpoints. And you don't need a sophisticated AI system to be able to produce that. You can just crop the video on your phone, or you can download a 99-cent app to do it. And so Twitter's policies in this space, which we enforce globally and at scale, are focused not just on the most sophisticated cases, but on the everyday examples of media that's being taken out of context to try to harass and abuse people. And in India in particular, we combine two things. The first is our policy, which applies labels to tweets that share misleading and out of context media. But second, and I think more importantly, we have a curation function that brings together the voices of experts, fact checkers, folks in the open source research community, investigative journalists who are tweeting about media manipulation, who are tweeting about some of these misinformation campaigns. And we bring together and package that context and make it available alongside instances of manipulated media. And so what you have there is not just an intervention by a platform in a punitive way, you have an integrated product solution that says, here's what you're seeing. And you might see this video on Twitter, you might see it in a WhatsApp group, you might see it on some other platform. And here are experts who are presenting the forensic evidence that explains what was going on. And we think those kinds of integrated solutions are the key to starting to move past some of the information challenges that are coming up here. Now, that's one policy area in one slice of the harassment and disinformation environment that's affecting women in India. There's a lot of others, but I think it highlights that you can't approach these things just as a question of find the stuff and remove it from Twitter. You have to think holistically about policy interventions, product interventions. You have to, going back to a comment Moira made at the start of the conversation, you have to think about how you can have pro-social design that is built from the ground up to protect women. This idea of safety by design that products like Bumble have deployed so effectively. Those are the long-term solutions in this space. And I think you're starting to see the industry move more in that direction.
Thank you.
Susan,
Asha, I wanted, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick two finger on everything Yael just said, but one I just want to make sure we all understand. It's that we're talking about the intention of the attack and the content of the attack. A phenomenon that we're starting to see around the world, we're seeing it here in the United States, is that when two women are engaged in a political debate and there's a gendered attack from one woman to another woman, it tends to be discounted by both the public and often by the social media companies. So I think it's just really important, as Yoel laid out, for us to really isolate what we're talking about, because it is possible for women to deploy gender-based attacks against other women. So just I know we're all on the same page, but I think for our audience to understand, there is a complication there often for companies and for the general public.
That's right. Asha, I wanted to make sure that we gave you an opportunity to speak again, because I know you have to leave a little bit early. So floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry that I have to leave a few minutes early. I'm enjoying the discussion thoroughly. And I just wanted to really pick up on Moira's last point, actually, because what she was getting at there, at least what I think she was getting at there, was patriarchy is what we're talking about, and the manifestation of that on our platforms. And I think we just have to be so clear about that when we're talking about this specific issue. And one of the points that I really wanted to close with today was to go back to the points about the stakeholders in this conversation. We have spoken about policy, legislation, content moderation, how that can work in different manifestations, safety by design. But I think in all of this, a lot of this has been informed by the contributions of civil society, of researchers, of academics who really are on the ground doing the work to inform these different processes. And when we're talking about a multi-stakeholder approach, it is absolutely essential that we're talking about power analysis at the same time. Because when it comes to the equal and equitable participation of civil society, it's vital that that is recognized as we're going through these different processes. Often that we tend to find is that they are consulted in a very consultative measure, after the fact, after design, as policies being developed, and not seen necessarily as that particular stakeholder and partner who has to be part of that process all the way. And there are incredible civil society organizations who are working in India, for example. Take Back the Tech comes to mind, several organizations who are collecting this information and the data from that linguistic diversity perspective, who can feed into the processes, but whether they have the access to be able to do that, whether they have the reach and the capacity to be able to do that, is a persistent question. And this is in the context of going back again to that shrinking civil society space. This is global. We are looking at rule of law challenges here in Europe, but we are also seeing the challenges that civil society face across the world. So in order for these mechanisms that we're talking about, these solutions that we're moving to, these huge legislations that are being developed, we really have to think about the multi-stakeholder approach, not just being multi-stakeholder, but multi-dimensional and meaningful. And that's the only way it's going to be effective and impactful, to be able to reach the women and girls and everyone from marginalized groups on the ground, so that they do have safer spaces to be able to flourish within, because I think it's a crucial part of our democracies in our modern time.
Well said, indeed. And thank goodness for all of the groups around the globe that have been working on these issues and calling attention to the issue. We had talked previously about the national security question involving, or the impact on national security of gender disinformation in particular. And we have one question from Joris van Hoboken. Isn't there a danger that bringing national security will further militarize the online public sphere in ways that are incompatible with media and civic freedom? So it's looking at it from a little bit different perspective. Would anyone like to comment on that?
So I often talk about disinformation being securitized in the way that the government approaches the issue. We talk about it as only a national security issue. We talk about it as something the State Department and the NSC and DOD have to deal with. And rarely do we talk about the human cost and the human participation in disinformation. And so I think as long as we think about it as this holistic phenomenon that involves culture, that involves we don't have a Ministry of Culture here in the States, but I like to see when other countries have their ministries of culture involved in their responses to disinformation. The Department of Education, Health and Human Services, the National Endowment for the Humanities. We should be bringing all of these entities together to make sure that people who actually have day-to-day contact with US citizens, I'm talking about the American situation right now, are involved in the US response to disinformation. I think that's really, really extraordinarily important. As long as we do that, I don't see it being a detriment to media freedom. I think media freedom is connected to our national security. We need to acknowledge that. The fact that when journalists were manhandled by law enforcement during the George Floyd protests, that was a talking point and remains a talking point of Russian propagandists in Russia to this day and will be for many years to come. That's part of national security as well. So all of these things are interconnected. I don't see an encroaching militarization. I think, unfortunately, because women aren't taken seriously sometimes, because our experiences and our lived experiences and stories and the impact that we say that this abuse has on us is not believed or taken seriously. Sometimes the only way to get people's attention is to say, this is making our country less safe. This is making our democratic process vulnerable to outside interference. Unfortunately, I think that's what it's come to, because I am waved away, even sometimes by friends and family who just say, ignore the trolls. It's impossible to ignore them. It is as if you are walking down the street or sitting in your office surrounded by people who are picking apart every part of your identity, undermining your expertise, and saying that you should be in the kitchen or making babies. And our adversaries are using that to undermine us as well. And so I think it's a really important line to draw, and one that I'm unafraid of continuing to keep drawing.
Bringing it back to the United States, and as you said, in terms of national security, the level of harsh discourse that goes on certainly in the US and around the globe is growing in frightening dimension, where the acceptability of horrific attacks on each other are not only in the public sphere, but also in legislatures, and including the US Congress, as we've seen. One questioner said, I need a research program to support modernization of the US Congress's communications architecture in the US House of Representatives. What content moderation would you advise to give the technologists working on this mission? Death threats against members have doubled since the 6th of January. We're also seeing the agents of networked harassment in Congress itself as elected leaders. Any comments on that? And then we'll start to wrap up. Go ahead. Who would like to pick up on that? Brittan?
I can jump in. But please, Brittan, I was going to say, but I'd love to hear what Brittan had to say here.
Yeah, I think some of the, like Yoel was talking about, looking at some of the patterns of behavior in addition to the content is a a way to help automated systems capture and be proactive about this. So I think that also reaches back to Joris's question before, like, how do we keep a freedom of expression-centric space while still combating harassment? And I think looking at behaviors that harm the health of the entire network, in addition to placing us at national security risk, I wanted to point out the brigading policy, because that I think is progress in this space in a way that we've been really wanting for a long time. But that's the way I think we can do it, by giving technologists the tools, and with the research consortium, helping them identify these technical trends about how people are trying to manipulate the network beyond just individually targeting people with distressing content.
Moira, go ahead.
I was going to say to the questioner's sort of direct question, one of the things we have to make sure that we're doing here is taking this beyond an idea of bullying or political catfighting or any of that, and address it as we are in this conversation, but that we have to constantly reemphasize that these are acts of violence. And, you know, it is a threat. Just because it's tweeted doesn't make it less of a threat, but it is an attack. And, you know, when we think about what Brittan experienced and what she had to go through and a legal framework to justify that, the best thing we can do for Brittan is not give up that ground and keep advancing that effort to make sure that we call it what it is and we address it as violence. In terms of, you know, the US Congress, I think we've seen some of this play out in recent activity, but one of the things we do hope that legislatures around the world will do is really have and emphasize and operationalize codes of conduct, not just for themselves, which would be a big step forward, and for candidates, but also for constituents, and what is acceptable and how elected leaders should be treated, and the accountability that we all have to create a political space that allows for conversation around critical issues. So, you know, when we talk about ways, you know, we can certainly advise on things that should be flagged, but we shouldn't lose sight of the opportunity we have to use technical solutions to enforce an accountability among leaders and among people in creating a political discourse that is healthy and productive. There's too many members of Congress right now that go to work every day to death threats. And, you know, imagine what we could do with that time if these women could spend their time just doing the work of our country rather than having to protect themselves and emotionally wake up every day ready to take on that challenge. And I think that's the environment we have to work to create and can create the technical solutions around.
And I think the technician who wrote that question is also concerned about how this is increasingly becoming legitimized, normalized to have this kind of behavior, even within and among members of Congress. Yoel, what advice, having obviously working so hard as a practitioner on a platform, what advice would you give this technician in terms of baking in some protections for members of Congress?
Yeah, I think it's a product. I think it's a product question. There's two elements of what I think we're talking about here. The first is the seriousness of the threats, which are a question that needs to be addressed at face value. If people are making threats against the lives of representatives and senators, that needs to be dealt with, and that needs to be brought to the attention of law enforcement, and it needs to be managed in that way. But I think we're also talking about the affective experience of being inundated with this stuff. And even if you have the thickest possible skin, it gets to you. And I think people shouldn't have to shoulder that burden. And I think that's where product solutions come to bear on it. One of the products that Twitter has introduced this year is a product called Safety Mode, which is a machine learning system that's meant to detect if somebody is experiencing a surge in potentially abusive or harassing behavior on the platform. And Twitter will proactively offer to temporarily block accounts that we detect as being potentially abusive. And the idea behind this product feature is when you are being harassed, it shouldn't be on you even to take the step of having to block the people who are harassing you. In that moment, it's better if some automated system just takes care of it. You can revisit it later, or it's temporary or something like that. And tools like Safety Mode or a great product called Block Party give people the ability to regain control of how they're using platforms like Twitter by engaging with abuse and harassment on their own terms, or potentially not engaging with it at all. Especially for public figures who are the subjects of threats, I think you have to engage with it at some point, or somebody should engage with it on your behalf. You can't just ignore it. It has consequences. Brittan talked to us about that. But you don't have to engage with it when you wake up in the morning. You don't have to engage with it when you're sitting in your office. It should be something that you can control and manage. And I believe platforms have a responsibility to build products like Safety Mode that put those controls in people's hands and make them easy to use. And also, we need to continue to cultivate a community of developers. And in many cases, these are women building incredible solutions for other women and for the people who are experiencing abuse online. We need to keep creating opportunities for those products to build on top of platforms like Twitter and Facebook.
That's fantastic. And hopefully there will be opportunity for civil society to participate in a meaningful way with the platforms to get that done. That would be great. We are coming to the end of the program. If you have any final comments that you want to make, half-minute of final comments, beginning with Nina, then Brittan and Moira, and then Yoel.
Great. So thanks again for organizing this event, Susan. And I guess my final comment would be that if you're going through this right now, if you are experiencing it for the first time, there are a lot of resources out there, many free resources put together by, for instance, PEN America, some women journalists organizations. There's a lot out there. I have a book coming out, but also feel free to reach out to me and others who can help. Community is really important for weathering these threats. And so in addition to building awareness like we're doing right now, I just want to put it out there that I'm there to help as well and try to shepherd you through the best I can. And you're not alone.
Thank you. Moira.
I would just urge us all to really remember that this is a solvable problem. And over the next week, as we see the Summit for Democracy, which will highlight this issue, but also very importantly, take a moment to raise a glass to Maria Ressa, who will accept the Nobel Prize, essentially for standing up and really drawing attention to this and related issues. We have global momentum around solving this problem, and we just need to seize this moment and this year of action and get it done.
Brittan, thank you. Brittan.
Yeah, I want to end with a note of optimism, where this is a serious problem, and countries around the world are working on it. Advocates, civil society, legal scholars, and politicians, but it does feel like things are starting to get better, and I think that looking at the trajectory of this, we are at an inflection point, and so thank you to Annenberg and NDI for putting on a program like this that kind of exemplifies that we can do something about this problem, and especially if all these interested parties are working together.
Thank you, Brittan. And y'all, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to foot stomp that I believe these problems are solvable. And one of the most important things that people can bring to the table is evidence and data and their experiences. And that shouldn't be a burden, that shouldn't be an obligation, but it's one of the most constructive things that people can do to help build the platforms that they want to see in the world. I think sometimes we, in a moment of techlash, can see platforms as unchanging or unwilling to change or not incentivized to change. And perhaps in some places that might be the case. But I can speak from within Twitter and say, we care very deeply about these issues. We want to improve. We haven't done enough, but the stories, the experiences, the reports, the recommendations, the suggestions, even the really angry tweets telling us that we're falling short, those help. And they help us understand where the opportunities are. Please keep reporting. Please keep telling us about these issues. It isn't hopeless. It's a tractable problem. And the best thing that we can do is make the conversation as specific and as grounded as possible.
Well, thank you all, our panelists. This has been a very rich conversation, as well as an uplifting one at the end, to be sure. I also want to thank the audience for joining us for this conversation today. I want to thank the staff at the Annenberg Public Policy Center and the Annenberg Public Policy Center and the National Democratic Institute for putting on the session today. Wishing everyone a very good day. Thank you and goodbye.